Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to give everyone a minute to get connected here before we officially kick off. All right. Looks like, oh, we still got a few people popping in, but we can go ahead and get started here. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We are here for another wonderful book pop-up conversation this today on a very timely topic on the war on tenure and how we should be thinking about tenure and why it is worth protecting in academia. So I'll get to those specific introductions in a moment, but as we are all here, just want to remind you all to please follow the HXA way, especially in the chat. We love lively side conversation going on during the conversation that we'll be having with Deepa here today on her book. But please just be mindful to follow the HXA way in the chat during the event. And then we also would like to invite you, if you are not already, to please subscribe to our newsletter. That's where you hear about all the latest news from Heterodox Academy, including upcoming events such as this one and various events going on throughout our communities, both in person on campuses across the country and also virtually as well. We also have our Free the Inquiry Substack, so if you're not subscribed to that, please do so, and that's where you'll get timely articles from the HXA staff on key issues occurring in higher ed right now. And of course, if you are not already, but you work in higher education in any capacity, faculty, staff, administration, or are enrolled in a graduate studies program, we encourage you to become a member and join the more than 8,000 other folks that are working with us to protect open inquiry on campus. So please also follow us on social media. There's lots of ways to stay up to date. And if you'd like to meet other Heterodox Academy members and other folks interested in our key issues, we are starting regional conferences. We've hosted two already, one at Colorado State and also most recently a few weeks ago at University of Maryland. Our next regional conference will be hosted at Simon Fraser University later this month. And we also already have a regional conference set up for next summer. So save the date if you are in the Mountain West region or are interested in traveling out to University of Wyoming. We have a wonderful group of campus communities there, and we're looking forward to seeing kind of a second regional conference for the Mountain West region. All right, and today, as I mentioned, we are joined here by Deepa Das Acevedo to talk about her brand new book. She is a legal anthropologist at Emory Law, whose work bridges ethnographic fieldwork, anthropology, and legal analysis to illuminate how rules and institutions shape society. Her research focuses on employment regulation, particularly faculty tenure, which is going to be the subject of our conversation today, law and politics in India, and the anthropology of law. She's the editor of Polar Political and Legal Anthropology Review, a past trustee of the Law and Society Association, and has held leadership roles in the Association of American Law Schools, the American Anthropological Association, and the Association for Political and Legal Anthropology. So, Deepa, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Nicole. I'm excited.
Yeah. For everyone that's listening, we're going to start off with kind of a broad conversation about the book, what your big argument is, and, kind of get into all the nitty-gritty details that you get into. It's a really rich and informative book. I absolutely loved it. It just came out in September. So please, if you find this conversation interesting, we're not going to have time to get into all the details in the book, but I please encourage you to support academic authors and please go purchase the book. And as we're talking, if you do have questions today that you would like answered in our conversation, please do drop them in the Q&A box. Obviously, everyone can chat in the chat, but I'll be monitoring the Q&A box specifically for questions. So make sure you drop those there and upvote ones that you want to make sure that we answer. Usually we can't quite get to every single one. But with that said, I would love to start with just kind of what inspired you to write this book. I think while I was reading it, you mentioned this was actually what was supposed to be a small side project while writing a different book. So can you just tell the listeners today kind of what inspired you to end up writing an entire book on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. This is definitely one of those moments where random thoughts get blown out of proportion and end up taking over your life, which happens a lot in academia, right? But during 2020, I was writing a different book that had nothing to do with higher ed or tenure or employment law. And I was doom scrolling in between chapters. And this was a moment where, many of us will remember committees, departments, even entire institutions were being closed down in response to the shock of the pandemic. And most of the scholars, most of the faculty who lost their jobs during that period were non-tenure track faculty. But I noticed even in the reporting that there were hints, and I followed this up in some of my early investigation, but there were a lot of tenured or tenure stream faculty who also lost their jobs during that period. And it just made me wonder, as somebody who teaches employment law, as somebody who was in that moment a tenure track faculty member, as somebody who's a third generation academic, how often do tenured professors lose their jobs despite having tenure? I assume there was a lot of literature in higher education scholarship on this, attacking it from a kind of empirical perspective, but I've been doing this for 5+ years now, and as far as I can find out, there really wasn't. So I set out to build this data set that focused on individual for-cause terminations of tenured faculty. And over the course of building that data set, I realized that there's really a much broader conversation to be had about what tenure stream academia looks like, what the credentialing processes are like, what the labor dynamics are like, and really what tenure means from an employment perspective.
Yeah, and I would love to kind of start on that big piece because when I sat down to read this book, typically if someone sees a book with this kind of title, The War on Tenure, or is thinking about the defense of tenure, following state legislation, trying to get rid of tenure, the typical argument is typically an academic freedom argument. We need tenure for academic freedom. But that's not really the angle that you took with this book. And I was very pleasantly surprised while I read this book of what a fascinating reframe this is for understanding tenure. So I would love for if we can just kind of start off big and then we can dive into different aspects. But you come at tenure and the reason that we need tenure really from an employment law perspective based on your background and your expertise. So why did you approach it this way rather than that academic freedom angle? And what's the value added looking at tenure from an
Yeah.
employment law perspective specifically?
For sure. So, I mean, the easy answer is that I am a labor and employment law scholar. I teach employment law almost every single year. I teach other work law subjects. So I think about labor practices and job security and job markets and credentialing and all of those things quite a lot. In the employment law course that I teach, I spend weeks, over 1 month, talking about the baseline rule of indefinite employment relationships in the United States, which is the at-will rule of employment. And I talk about that a little bit in the book. But I talk about that rule. I talk about carve outs to that rule that fall under the broad umbrella of just cause employment. And I kind of briefly mention tenure as one variety of just cause contract that acts against the insecurity created by this default rule of at will employment that we have. So I think about these things a lot. It is kind of naturally the way I approach issues of employment relationships. But I think it is also that I really wanted to explain what it is that professors do. What does that life look like? What does that job look like? What does it take to get the job? And what are the odds of getting it? Because these are a lot of the questions that I think non-academic readers are often most curious about. And as grateful as I am for all of the thoughtful, nuanced, academic, freedom-oriented explanations of tenure that we have out there, and there's a rich, long-standing literature about that, those conversations don't necessarily speak to these questions that we hear a lot from outside the academy. Um, I also, I think, generally am kind of personality wise attracted to standstill conversations where, both sides are kind of rehashing familiar arguments for a long period of time, and there just really isn't much movement forward. And I think that's something else that I see in debates over tenure. You know, from inside the academy, we say we need tenure because it makes academic freedom possible. It is a necessary, if not sufficient condition of possibility for academic freedom. That's true, but saying that over and over again has not necessarily helped us communicate the value of tenure to an external, non-academic audience that either doesn't understand what we are often confronted with in the academy or isn't persuaded by the academic freedom justification for tenure. So I really wanted to focus on tenure as an employment protection, as a labor protection, not only because it builds on my strengths and my interests, but I think it might provide a new perspective that helps us kind of move out of this familiar pattern conversationally that we've seen for decades now.
Yeah, and I think I really appreciated that where it just adds something, at least for me as someone who's more consuming these arguments about tenure. I'm not a tenured faculty myself, so I'm not really kind of in the the war on tenure at this point. But I think framing it as employment law kind of this is a paradox that you bring up in the book a lot, is it kind of makes academia seem a little not as special as sometimes we make it out to be, whereas there's also these arguments that academia is very special in a lot of respects as well, which I think is an interesting paradox. But for listeners that, like me, I just am used to the default assumption of at-will employment because that's just, as you said, the default here in the US. So I found it really informative reading your book from an employment law perspective, just really understanding that. But for those listening, can you maybe break down in the most simple sense, like what is at-will employment and why is that the default in the US? Because you mentioned in the book too that we're really only seeing this problem in the US because other countries don't have this default
Nobody
will
else does
employment.
this.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
can you dive into that a little bit?
Sure. So in the United States, if you're classified as an employee as opposed to an independent contractor who is hired to provide a particular discrete service or product, if you're an employee and you're hired potentially for an indefinite basis, so it's not like you start the job and it's a 5-year contract or a 3-year contract. You start the job and you're going to continue in that job for as long as you want or until you get fired. That's indefinite employment. In the United States, if you're hired as an employee on an indefinite basis, then the default assumption is that your employment contract exists at will. So, what that means is that either you or your employer can end the employment relationship at will for any reason. This could be a good reason, it could be a bad reason, it could be for no reason at all. Your employer could walk into work one day, and the example that I love to give is that you're wearing a teal shirt or a purple shirt or something, and your employer hates that color. And they say, Nicole, you're wearing purple. I hate purple. You're fired. That's a bad reason to fire someone, but it's not an illegal reason. And in the United States, that would be legally permissible. Your employer would not need to give you notice that they're going to fire you 2 weeks from now because you wore a purple shirt. They don't need to give you any kind of severance payment if they fire you instantaneously for wearing that purple shirt. So it creates a lot of insecurity for the average employee. Most people don't realize that this is the basis on which their jobs exist, that it could disappear tomorrow for pretty much any reason under the sun with certain kind of very specific limitations that are spelled out in law. So what tenure is a category, it belongs to a category of employment contracts that provide more security than this baseline at-will rule. The entire kind of category of more secure employment relationships are called just cause contracts. And the name pretty much explains what it means. If you have a just cause contract instead of an at-will contract, then your employer needs reasonable grounds or just cause to fire you. They can't just say, I hate purple or it's Tuesday. They have to say, you have consistently missed work and that makes it impossible for this office to run, or you falsified certain work product that you created for us. Those are reasonable grounds for terminating an employment relationship. And lots of workers, lots of employees in the United States are employed pursuant to these kinds of just cause contracts. Tenure is a subset of that. It's a special form of just cause. It has some features that all just cause contracts have. And it's the combination of those features that tends to make it a little bit unusual. But the idea that you have greater employment security than the average employee in the United States is not limited to tenure or to professors. Everyone who has a just cause contract has that extra security.
So in this framing, tenure is, as you said, just kind of a variation on a different type of employment contract, which in a way shows that tenure isn't super special in a kind of employment law way. It's just a different way to ensure that to be fired, you have to have a reason to a good reason to be fired. And a lot of your book too sets up, we were talking about this a little bit before we went live, sets up kind of what it takes to actually become a professor. Because in the employment law perspective, tenure isn't this exceptional thing that is protecting just professors. It's just a just cause kind of employment contract. But part of the reason that we need that is because of, you mentioned this briefly, the credentialing process that goes along with becoming a tenured academic, the kind of hyper specialization that we all have. Every academics have their niche interest areas. So in that way, academics and specifically tenure track faculty are special and exceptional because of, you lay out a lot of these reasons in the book. Can you kind of, I don't know, square that little paradox of, academia and tenure track professors are special, but their employment status also isn't in an employment law way? I think it's an interesting paradox that you bring up.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about labor and job market dynamics rather than the law, because I think sometimes these things get muddled altogether. There are a lot of professions that require some of the things that make tenure track academia so difficult and kind of hard to pursue, right? If you think of things like professions like medicine or law, um, they require extended postgraduate training that is expensive and difficult to do. So broadly similar, right? But very few professions that are kind of comparable to academia combine all the specific things that becoming a tenure stream academic or even becoming eligible to become a tenure stream academic involve. So very few, let's stick with medicine and law, combine extended periods of postgraduate training that are really expensive. So you probably incur a lot of debt or forego, the opportunity to earn and save, or both of those things. Very few of them have such low odds of actually getting the job that you're training for. There aren't really viable statistics on this, but the numbers that I've been able to find usually put the odds of becoming a tenure stream academic, assuming that you actually finish your PhD, at around 10 to 20%. Very few of those professions involve multiple successive involuntary relocations to places that you may have no connection to and have no desire to live in, and that your family can't follow you to, um, as well as low wages once you get that job, if you get that job, and long hours of work. And all of these things are true of academics, regardless of your pedigree or your degree of accomplishment. It's not like you can escape these things if you graduate from a top 5 university, or you get all the grants and you publish all of the articles and all of that. If you consider medicine, yes, it takes many years to be trained to become a medical doctor. Yes, you will incur high debt in the process, and yes, you will work long hours even if you get that job, but you have good odds of getting that job. which is not true of academics, right? You don't need to relocate as often. You probably need to move once for your residency, once maybe if you do a specialization. But we see academics hopping through serial postdocs, 2, 3 at a time, and then you have to move for your first job if you actually get one, and so on. And if you're a medical doctor, you're going to earn decent money in most practice areas once you get that job. That is also not true of academics. The vast majority of professors, or at least many disciplines, professors in many disciplines, could earn as much or more in the general labor market. Sometimes they could earn more with a lower credential, with a master's instead of a PhD. So there are lots of things that are similar as between medicine and academia, but there are lots of things that are different and that make academia different, right? We could say something similar about law, but the point that I want to make is that no one hardship that academics have to go through in order to even play the game, let alone have to go through once they get the job. No one element is absolutely unique to academia, but the combination is relatively unusual. And I haven't really found any profession that combines all of these challenges in one place.
Yeah. Yeah, so in the one sense, from your perspective, in part, you're arguing tenure is that special just cause case of tenure is really needed because of all of these things that you just described make tenure or becoming a tenure track academic a very unique journey to get there, with a lot of very intense labor dynamics that come along with once you actually have that job. Now, this, I would love to take this and also kind of take a step back to what motivated the tenure process. You bring up the history a little bit in the book. So if we see, tenure as a way, as something that universities can offer folks that have done this
Mhm.
long journey that have to relocate and, don't necessarily get the wages to counter all of these sacrifices that have been made, usually over more than a decade of training time. Um, the history of tenure, as you put it in the book, is often boils down to some early cases in the 20th century, that motivated this need for this job protection and this tenure status for faculty. And then also, the 1940 AUP statement as a big kind of milestones in the history of tenure. But your book actually goes and kind of reframes that as those weren't necessarily the catalysts. Can you talk about that a little bit and kind of what your perspective on the history of tenure is relative to the mainstream narrative?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually have a short piece that just came out in Time magazine's Made by History vertical that also speaks to this history. But it's not that I think the conventional history of how tenure came to be a normative industry practice in academia is wrong. It's that I think it's kind of too late and too short in terms of the window that it gives us, and that there are consequences of this framing for how we present tenure to non-academic
Mm.
audiences. So on the too late front, there were versions of indefinite, as in not term limited, employment that could only be ended for cause. Basically, since the founding of Harvard College in 1650, there have been many moves back and forth between term contracts and indefinite contracts, how that relationship can be ended for cause, usually. There have been a lot of movements back and forth since that founding of the first college in colonial America. Over the period of the 1700s to roughly 1900s. But I think what is really important about this part of the story is that something that even was occasionally called tenure existed before the 1940 statement was issued. Now, the 1940 statement really made a difference because it introduced a due process requirement to tenure. So, saying that you're employed indefinitely, that you can only be fired for cause, for some reasonable grounds, that matters, and that's part of the prehistory of tenure that I'm trying to excavate in the book. But it only gets you so far if a violation of those terms doesn't also trigger a due process element, that you aren't entitled to contest your termination. And that's really the contribution that the 1940 statement makes. I think also that the conventional history of tenure, which starts around 1900, with Edward A. Ross being terminated by Stanford University because of this sort of public scholarship and political positions and everything, and ends with the 1940 statement that the AUP issues, that also ends it a little bit too soon, so it doesn't quite start far back enough and it ends it a little bit too quickly. And the reason I say that is that, yes, the 1940 statement kind of creates the modern template for tenure, and it makes a significant advance by introducing that due process requirement. But it's not like the creation of that template being taken forward by faculty is what translated tenure into becoming an industry norm, kind of like a common practice. What we really see is that tenure becomes popularized not just because faculty want it, they do, but because administrators learn that it's a valuable recruitment and retention tool. And this happened at a moment in American history where administrators of universities really needed to recruit and retain scholars, people who had long, hard, expensive, training behind them and could have taken that training into industry. But because we had certain things happening at this moment in time, we needed them, universities needed them to come into academia where they probably earn less, but at least they'd have job security. So I'll just close by saying, what were those things that happened, not right in 1940, but in the years that followed? Well, there were a few. One was we had the GI Bill in 1944, right? This meant that we had an influx of new students who needed to be taught. We had people in seats and we needed people behind the podium in order to teach them. And that was one thing that motivated administrators to kind of make academia a more desirable career path for people who were qualified to pursue it. Another thing is that in the post-war era, we had this kind of influx of philanthropic support and governmental interest, primarily motivated by national security concerns. But all of this generated new disciplines. International studies kind of takes root, area studies takes root. These are new fields of knowledge, and we need people to advance knowledge in them, to preserve and then to share that knowledge with all of those new students who are coming in. Again, you need to give those people who have spent a lot of time building expertise a good reason to pursue this path that pays them less. One of those reasons is that you give them job security. And so what we see is that although 1940 and the period that it kind of brackets, 1900 to 1940, that is an important moment in the kind of transformation and development of higher education labor practices. But the story is much broader than that. It starts earlier with indefinite employment contracts and kind of experimentation that happened from the 17th century onwards. And it goes later with efforts by administrators to bring in academics to serve needs that they saw and that they needed to fulfill. And if we look at it that way, we can kind of see that, yes, academic freedom violations were an important contributing factor to the development of tenure, but tenure also spoke to employment considerations, recruitment and retention considerations that are often left out of the story of how it came to be.
Yeah. So the one of the attractive benefits of going into a field that requires a lot of training, a lot of specialization, and not super high wages is that, job security that you get. So after you do all of those things, you know that you can continue pursuing that area of study for, tens of decades, depending on when you
Exactly.
start. Yeah. And so, that's one of the big benefits of tenure. Obviously, and this will kind of shift us into more of the typical arguments for tenure. And one of the parts I enjoyed a lot about your book is kind of busting some of the myths about tenure. So I would love to get into that as well. So Tenure is an attractive recruitment and retention tool, especially for administrators who are trying to staff the professor in an area of rapid growth. We have a little bit less of a supply problem nowadays for folks that want to be a professor. But what else does tenure do in terms of once you have tenure and you're a faculty, what does it do? I know you mentioned in your book, it allows people the freedom to fail. Can you expand on what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to just note, Nicole, that the historical argument is historically contingent. Tenure became a normative industry practice because of circumstantial factors that no longer exist. So if we want to explain why tenure makes sense, why tenure is still valuable and necessary, we need to move beyond that historical context, right? And I think that there are very solid ways to do that. So I talk a little bit about the freedom to fail, as you mentioned, but I think that what I'm trying to convey with that is that being an academic these days, even if we only consider the teaching and the research components of that job, and those aren't the only things that you have to do as a professor, but we'll just focus on that because those are kind of at the core of the university and academic mission, right? Um, Being an academic who teaches and who researches these days requires a kind of long horizon that in turn requires job security. So, what do I mean by that? I mean that teaching now doesn't involve just sort of walking into a class, strolling in, standing behind a podium, speaking for an hour, and then walking out, right? Teaching now involves encountering large student bodies. The closure of universities or the reductions of faculty doesn't easily translate into smaller classrooms for the people who are left behind. It often means combined classrooms, larger student populations with increasingly diverse backgrounds and needs, which means that you are trying to teach to multiple different perspectives and foundational knowledges and interests and learning styles, which in turn requires you to experiment. You have to try flexible assignments, partial assignments, revised, new attempts at revising and resubmitting work, um, flipped classrooms and new educational technologies. All of these things are experimental. But when you teach, you don't really get to fix your mistakes, and nobody teaches you what to do or how to avoid those mistakes. So let's say you try out a new casebook, or you try a new syllabus structure, or you pursue a new lesson plan in fall of 2025. And you learned that some parts of that new approach or new material set worked, but other things didn't. You don't get to try that again, maybe for a year, maybe for a year and a half, but you will be graded on that. Your employment, security will be dependent on that. And if you don't have some assurance that you get multiple chances to become a better teacher, to become better, at responding to students' needs and changing circumstances and technologies, you would never try anything new. In a way, the very thing that the public wants from academia, more innovative and responsive teaching, requires some security so that you can try those changes. You can see what works. It's even easier to see why you need kind of freedom to fail in the research context, whether we're talking about experimental or lab sciences or historical research in the archives or field research. I'm an anthropologist. We're going out there for 6 months, 12 months at a time doing work. The timeline of research that can produce valuable insights and contributions to society, and we still generally want people to do these things, the timeline for that research isn't months or years even, it's often decades. You have to develop the research project. You have to make multiple attempts at getting it funded. You have to actually conduct the research, which may take years at a time. You may not come up with anything interesting on the first round, or your lab might have some kind of supply chain snafu, and so you can't proceed the first time. Then you discover something other than what you had planned. The timeline for this isn't a couple weeks or a couple of months, it's years. And if in that period you are hopping between jobs, having to switch labs, not being able to set up a lab because it takes time to do that, not being able to conduct that research, going to the archive, interviewing all of those people, conducting the background literature searches, then you can't do the work. The timeline on which academics do their jobs, whether that's understood as teaching or as research, isn't very much like the timeline on which a lot of other workers do their jobs. It's measured in years and decades, and consequently, you need jobs that can last for years and decades, and that's what tenure allows.
Yeah. So instead of being graded on a quarterly scale, like most, kind of corporate jobs are, we're looking at, as you said, years or decades to see results and refine teaching techniques and really become even more of an expert and contribute to the knowledge function that we
Exactly.
want universities to have. Now, you come to this conclusion in your book kind of after dispelling kind of, is tenure for protecting heterodox ideas and heterodox scholars, which I think fits into the sub of, freedom to fail. So you can pursue these different types of ideas. But I would love to dive into kind of that area, especially given the name of our organization and what we're often discussing here. And this also ties into an audience question as well. So I'll take their framing a little bit too. How can tenure possibly be said to be supportive for those with heterodox ideas, especially when the process of achieving tenure often mitigates against heterodox thinking and often incentivizes conformity in a lot of ways. So, I guess it's a little bit of a two-part. One, does tenure protect for heterodox ideas? I know you discuss this a lot in your book, but also with actually becoming a professor, how are those two things also in tension when it seems that a lot of the time you know, there's often this, keep your mouth shut until you get tenure, kind of that line of advice. So how do you think about those things?
Yeah.
With your perspective on tenure?
It's interesting, right? I think that tenure is often critiqued either for promoting conformity or for promoting kind of renegadism, right? And it's never anything in between. It's either you are forcing people into a box or you're unleashing them on the world in ways that are socially suboptimal. And I think the answer is somewhere in between, you know. I think that tenure, if we understand that to mean the elements of the employment contract, which is what tenure is, not the university environment, which is far greater, far bigger, and more amorphous than tenure. But if we understand tenure to mean just cause employment with some special features like strong peer evaluation at various moments and a probationary period before you get that just cause contract, it doesn't intrinsically or unusually, like to an unusual degree, motivate conformity, or it doesn't need to, is what I'm saying. I think most workplaces, whether they're academic or not, encourage conformity to a certain degree. This is how we tolerate being around people who are otherwise strangers for 8 to 10 hours a day. We learn to kind of maybe not bring our authentic selves fully to the workplace. We learn to speak in ways that are likely to actually reach across perspective divides. We learn to time our kind of articulation of contrary perspectives or our requests or things. This is what it means to work with other people. And academia is no different. So, to the extent that working with other people requires conforming yourself to your surroundings, yes, absolutely. Academia, in addition to tenure, requires you to do that. It probably even requires you to do that a little bit more than average because this is a very small universe, right? If you're an accountant, the universe that you belong to professionally is far broader. If you are an anthropologist, by contrast, the universe you belong to is significantly smaller. Now, if you're a legal anthropologist or an anthropologist who works in South Asia, that universe is really small. So naturally, the kind of conformity enhancing effects are going to be a little bit stronger in academia. But that's academia, that's not tenure. right? I also think that it's important to remember the relatively low rates of sort of ideological nonconformity or renegadism um, are not necessarily indications of failure, whether of academia as a workplace environment or an industry, or tenure as an employment contract form. As knowledge progresses, our additions to it are likely to be smaller, more incremental refinements. They are not likely to be vast, disrupt the boat kind of contributions because we simply know more, right? And so you're tweaking, you're adjusting, you're refining. The fact that that's what you're doing does not necessarily mean that you are being inhibited from doing anything else. It might mean that you are trying to build productively on what has existed before you, and there's a hell of a lot existing before you now as compared to 200 years ago, right?
It's an excellent point.
All of that said, I just want to make one last point, which is that until around 2021, which is when my individual termination data collection closed, the tenure termination study that takes up the last part of the book, until that data collection closure date, I would say that tenure did protect scholars across the ideological spectrum pretty well. And the reason I would say that is because the number of terminations in my data set for that period where the terminated faculty member, this is somebody who ultimately lost their job, right? The data set in my book is a post-mortem, essentially. But even the terminated faculty member rarely said that their termination was in violation of their speech or academic freedom rights. It's about 10% of the entire data set. That's pretty good. Now, if my data collection had extended, to the present day, I don't think it would necessarily look that way. But again, does that tell us something about tenure, or does it tell us something about the current sociopolitical moment?
Yeah, and on that's actually an excellent segue to kind of the current moment that I would love to discuss with you. Now, there's a lot of attacks right now, especially with state legislators on reducing tenure protections. And I think I would love to know, with the conversation of tenure being primarily framed as an academic freedom one, and I think one of the misconceptions based on the data that you present in your book, one of the misconceptions is that tenure protects, the idea that tenure protects lazy professors. There's a lot of details in your book about why that's an unfounded conception, but given that that seems to be a popular conception, and tenure protections are being stripped, do you think reframing tenure or coming at tenure from the angle that you have with employment law would potentially change how how legislation is approaching tenure? I know it's a really big, wide open question, but I'm just curious if that was the dominant narrative, do you think we would be seeing the same kind of attacks, or how do you think that reframing, if you could convince
Look,
everyone?
is kind of busting some of the myths surrounding tenure. Sorry, there's a little bit of noise in the hallway, but hopefully it'll pass soon. Is busting some of the classic myths surrounding tenure and how it affects faculty incentives going to convince, a Dan Patrick or Ron DeSantis about the worth of higher education and of tenure stream employment within it? No. Look, I'm not delusional. But I think that explaining why the reasonable but misguided understandings a lot of us, including inside academia, have about how tenure works, explaining why they're both reasonable and misguided, has the potential to change the way constituents understand academia and view tenure. So the goal for me was not to convince legislators or policymakers necessarily about why tenure makes sense, what tenure is responding to in terms of labor dynamics and job market dynamics, and so on. The goal for me was to translate academia and especially tenure for a broader audience who are those legislators and policymakers' constituents, because I think they need to see what actually goes on inside the so-called ivory tower. We don't do a good enough job of explaining it. So how can we expect anyone else to understand it?
It's an excellent point. Yeah. And another thing that you bring up in your book with response to this is whether faculty can unionize or not. And I know that's a whole other trail that we could go down, but is there any, if tenure protections actually do begin to be stripped, as they are in some places, would this actually allow faculty to more readily unionize? And if so, is that
It
actually
could. Yeah.
counter to the goals of legislators that are trying to strip tenure protections?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know that I can sufficiently uh, put myself in the mental shoes of a state legislator trying to eviscerate tenure in higher ed to be able to fully answer the cost benefit question. But I can say that, yeah, if tenure continues to be eviscerated, if faculty continue to be employed on a non-tenure stream, contingent, contract basis, then there's a good argument to be made that faculty unionization, even at private universities where it has historically been lower, could increase. There's a 1980 decision from the Supreme Court involving Yeshiva University, which basically established that tenure line faculty at private universities are not necessarily protected for their Section 7 concerted activity, right, under the National Labor Relations Act. And I'm not the one who kind of makes this point that I'm about to articulate. Frank Donahue, who's a historian of higher ed, makes it. And I thought it was so insightful that I kind of wanted to borrow it as well for the book. But Frank makes the point that by degrading academic labor, by pushing academics towards a gig model or an adjunct model, essentially what higher ed leaders and politicians have done is sort of sow the seeds of greater collaboration and resistance, because they've created this workforce of extremely smart, educated, and disillusioned workers who now are not legally outside the pale of federal statutory protections if they choose to engage in concerted activity, unionization, right? Um, Again, whether how that shakes out in terms of a cost benefit analysis from the perspective of a state legislature is something that I'm not even going to try to speculate about, but it is absolutely true that as academics, as tenure line academics become increasingly rare, the argument that unionization is not really a viable option for academics becomes weaker because the nature of academic employment has been changed.
Excellent. Thanks for that. That's really insightful, and it's going to be interesting to see how these things play out. And part of at least some of the reforms that are being put forward are like, okay, let's shift to long-term long-term contracts rather than kind of this indefinite lifetime job for life idea. How would, say, a new professor getting a 20-year contract instead of being awarded tenure, how would that change the nature of what tenure is supposed to do or what it does do for academics? So like from your perspective and expertise, why would a 20-year contract or a 30-year contract or whatever long-term contract not be as sufficient as what we currently have under a tenure model, for instance?
I'll be perfectly frank that I'm not sure it is guaranteed to be insufficient. The devil is always in the details,
Mhm.
right? And especially as somebody who teaches employment law and reads contracts pretty carefully, it really is in
All
the
is the
details,
details.
right? And I think that there is a growing number of us in higher ed who feel like it could be that a lot of what tenure does can be achieved through a long-term contract model. But here's the rub. I think that a truly long-term contract, a defined duration contract, 20 years, let's say,
Mm.
is that one that actually provides the kind of employment security and conditions of work that make tenure good at facilitating the teaching and research jobs that academics are hired to perform. A contract that sufficiently replicates tenure's advantages without actually being tenure is unlikely to both meaningfully reduce universities' financial burdens or change the aspects of academic labor dynamics that we legitimately take issue with. So if essentially what I'm saying is that if the contract in duration and terms was such that it could meaningfully offer the kind of job security that tenure offers and that I'm arguing is necessary for academics to do the work they've been hired to do, it's unlikely to solve a lot of the other issues that we have. So then what's the advantage? I mean, that potato, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Um, Now, speaking of the reform, as we kind of come up to the last section here, everyone always wants to know what are the solutions. Luckily, you do have some outlined in your book, again, which I encourage everyone listening to go read. But can you give us a rundown of what you propose, as you call it, Tenure 2.0? What reforms, what changes, what things can we do? To help reform tenure in positive ways without sacrificing the labor protection, but maybe alleviating some potential issues or perceptions of issues that folks have with tenure.
Yeah, so I think we can kind of think about next steps or possible solutions in at a variety of different levels of specificity, right? If we just are talking about the smallest tweaks that kind of make the system as it currently exists marginally better, then there are options there, some of which I mentioned in the book. So we could say that the process of sourcing, evaluating, and circulating the reference letters that are part of a tenure file when somebody goes up to be considered for tenure as a fifth or sixth or whatever your tenure track faculty. There are a lot of problems with that create uneven and unsustainable work dynamics for both the candidate and for the reference letter writer. And there are tweaks that we can make about that in terms of extending the shelf life or the playing with who asks for the letter, who keeps it, and so on. We could also create and reapportion weight allocations for the various tasks that faculty have to engage in order to be eligible at most institutions for tenure. Usually these are divided along teaching, research, and service, but we could I'm no fan of quantification, but sometimes that provides a way forward, particularly as the volume of decision making increases and administrators legitimately struggle to keep up with it. We could think about metrics and weightage systems and how to transfer points between one of those three buckets and another. So there are tweaks that we can make with the existing system at a kind of middle range of adjustment. We might think about reevaluating who is eligible for tenure on what basis. And so, along with a lot of other people who are observers of higher ed labor, I think that a teaching tenure track is an important change and one that's already started to be made at several institutions, but one which I think a lot more institutions could adopt. Teaching, as we've already discussed, is an increasingly time consuming effort and emotional bandwidth consuming process if you want to do it well. And I think thinking creatively about how to teach well, adapting to the moment, experimenting in ways that we all want teachers to do, this is a full job that is deserving of security in the form of tenure on its own. That's like a mid-level solution that we could take, right? I think most broadly, though, now it is the moment for us to really think about what the university is for. I think the university, personally, I think the university is about the creation and the preservation and the sharing of knowledge. But those are very onerous, complicated tasks today for a variety of reasons. And we need to start thinking about what labor goes into performing those tasks, what skills and credentials are really required to perform those tasks, and what are the conditions of work that would make those tasks possible in ways that may not look like what we understand to be the university in its current form. That's a big thing. So there's like a range of ways we can think about making higher ed labor, particularly focusing on tenure stream labor, better, tweaks, kind of mid-range solutions, and then big picture reimaginings. And, I think move on all fronts at once, essentially.
Yeah, I love the point that you bring up about tenure track teaching professors. This is a big personal like soapbox of mine that I think would be a wonderful advancement for higher ed professions. And we didn't even get into this specific topic in detail, but in your book you talk about the multi-hyphenation of the professor job and how many things professors are required to do. I think many of us have probably seen those like pie charts that kind of circulate around social media with like the 50 different jobs that a professor's performing. And I've always found it really bizarre that we expect someone who is highly skilled in research to also be highly skilled in teaching when they're just two
They are
I
not
think,
the
very
same
different
type of
jobs.
skills.
No.
Yeah.
So I think kind of splitting those up is one of the downsides to wanting to focus on teaching. If you go through all this training, you're like, I want to teach. That is the thing that I want to do. Even if you are trained to produce scholarship and research, your options are extremely limited if you want basically a full-time teaching. And typically those are, either you're going to be adjuncting or as be called a lecturer. So you don't even get the title
Yeah.
of professor. You're probably on sometimes semester to semester contracts, at best, sometimes 3 to 5 year contracts for teaching. But I think, especially the workplace or the university just being so different than it was, 60, 70
Yeah.
years ago in terms of the work that's being done, splitting that up might be a really helpful path forward to, produce
Absolutely. I think
disseminate further
academia, I
knowledge.
mean, this is nothing new and it's not, my original insight, but I think that academia needs to do a much better job of documenting, acknowledging, and respecting the immense work that goes into just being an effective classroom teacher today, or not
Yeah.
even classroom lab or anything, instructor today. And one of the ways to do that is to say, doing this work well requires some security. It requires the ability to learn, focus on how you teach better. That is almost a kind of research in and of itself. Pedagogical research is a thing,
Yeah.
And so there are really ways that we can think about fixing academic labor practices and tenure practices in particular at a whole range of levels. And I think we ought to be doing a little bit at every one.
Yeah, and I think that's a good kind of culmination and ending point for the discussion. And again, I just want to encourage everyone. I don't know if my filter's not going to be able. Oh, there it is.
There we go.
The filter's hard to get on there, but I encourage everyone to please go pick up this book. It's an incredibly insightful and detailed and highly engaging read. I think I devoured this in maybe 3 sittings because it's just such a good book. So
Thank you.
I really encourage folks to go read this. And where can people find you? Where can people find out more about your work? Where can people go online to learn more about your
Sure.
work?
So, I mean, I'm at Emory, but I have a personal website, which is just my full name, www.deepadasacevedo.com, and it has a little bit more information about my research and background and everything. And the book is available both through Cambridge and I believe through Amazon now.
Yes, awesome. And Marisa has dropped a link to the book in the chat. So please, it's always good to support academic authors. And thank you so much for being here. Make sure if you are listening to please subscribe to our emails to know when the next book pop-up conversation is going to be, when the next virtual event's going to be, and of course, when our live and in-person events are going to be. We host a ton of events throughout the academic year. So we would love to see you at those. Thank you for everyone coming. And Deepa, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It was wonderful to meet you and discuss this very important book of yours.
Thank you, Nicole. It was a blast.